From the Corner Office is brought to you by Synovus Bank, championing business growth through trusted relationship-driven banking throughout the Gulf Coast region. Chuck Wolfe has had a unique career trajectory, from a national leader with the Boy Scouts as a teenager, to running and winning political campaigns in Washington, D.C., to overseeing 3 beachfront restaurants in Manatee County. Writing stories about behind-the-scenes leaders like Chuck is something the Business Observer does well. To read those stories and more, every day online and every week in print, subscribe to the Business Observer. Go to businessobserverfl.com to sign up. Hello and welcome to the Business Observer's From the Corner Office podcast. I'm Mark Gordon, managing editor of the Business Observer. Today's guest is Chuck Wolfe, CEO of the Chiles Group. Chuck, welcome and thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're going to talk, Chuck, about the Chiles Group, what that is, and kind of your role there and what you guys have been doing of late. Talk about your career. I really think it's very fascinating, the different things that you've done in your career. We're going to get into that. But we're going to take even a step further back before we get into these serious leadership questions with some first ever. So, Chuck, tell us, what was your first car?
Great first question, because I'm a real car hobbyist. I love cars and always have since my early childhood. But my very first car I owned was a Volkswagen Squareback, 1970 Volkswagen Squareback. It was a 2-door station wagon. And I had it for less than a year before I totaled it into a telephone pole.
Oh, no.
Oh, I was so devastated because I had saved so much money and I had bought my first car, and my dad helped me with my first insurance, and luckily I had insurance, but of course that just totaled the car and it took me a while to get another one. I had a paper route, and a couple times early in my career, but this is when I'm in high school and I had a paper route, and I fell asleep delivering the newspapers and went off the road. And this was in Tallahassee, Florida. And the worst part about it was that I took out 2 dogwood trees on my way to the telephone pole.
Oh, man.
The homeowner's yard that I careened off into didn't care about the car or me, cared about the dogwood trees.
Dogwood trees, sure.
Because in Tallahassee, dogwood trees are like gold. So I learned a valuable lesson not to try to do too many jobs at once.
Yeah, early in the morning like that, so you fell asleep. Wow, and obviously you're here, but you were okay? Like, were you physically hurt?
I was fine. I mean, I was able to walk back to my home. I was only like 3 blocks from the house, and I was able to walk back to the house, and my mom took me to the hospital and, got cleaned up. And so.
Right. All right, well, one of those life lessons. Okay, the next first question, what was your first concert?
Oh, this is one of the more embarrassing answers. Up with People was the first concert I attended.
Up with People. I'm gonna be I don't know, ignorant what the word is, but what is Up with People? Tell us more. Tell us more about Up with People.
So Up with People is a it's religious adjacent, I think. It's about being uplifting, and I will not sing it for you, but basically the theme song is up with people. The more people you know, the better off we all are. That all people are good if you give them a chance, type of thing. So,
all right,
more people you know, the better off you are.
Hey, that's good messages, though. I mean, that's good.
It was great messaging. It's just a little embarrassing to say that it wasn't Foreigner, or that it wasn't some arena rock concert,
right,
as my first one, that it was an Up with People concert. So
yeah, wow. All right, and Chuck, what was your first ever job? Well, maybe it was being a paper boy, I don't know, but what was your first ever job?
Well, there are lots of categories first, right? So as a child, my first job was being a paper boy, and I lived in Palm Beach County, Florida. I was born and raised there. Early on, and I delivered both the Miami Herald and the Palm Beach Post on the weekends. During the week, it was just the Palm Beach Post, and then on the weekends, I would also deliver the Miami Herald, so the Sunday edition. And it would go out on, in many cases, half of it would go out on Saturday and half of it would go out on Sunday. I don't know if you remember the old days of getting the Sunday paper. Like half of it was printed for Saturday production, and half of it was printed for Sunday production with the news and sports. Um, but I would ride my bicycle, right? So I had this massive basket on the front, and I was a tiny kid. I was 4'11". I'm 6'1" now. I was 4'11" until my junior year of high school. So my growth spurt came very late, and maneuvering that bike with those heavy newspapers was really crazy. My dad was helpful in that there were times when the weather was so bad that it made no sense for me to try to do it on a bike, and he would drive the route for me, and I would throw him out the car window. But I was a tiny kid, right? And I think the first ability I had to exercise was learning to throw those big Sunday papers
Yes.
further than the curb.
Yes, very similar. I recall growing up on Long Island, New York, I was also a paper boy. I also had the bike, and I loved it when the weather was bad because I knew my dad would drive me. So I was a lazy kid, and I was like, if the rains, yes, he will drive me to do this. So, but very similar. I
More
remember.
than once, my bike tipped over, more
Yeah,
than you just have to pick it all up
you
and
got to
keep
pick it
going.
up.
So,
I have been there.
did you have a route where you had to go and collect from the people you were delivering to?
Yes, huge
Yes.
lesson for me, but man, that's hard. You're 11 years old and
Yep.
you're knocking on doors and yeah, Newsday and the New York Times was my delivery apparatus, my papers. Yeah.
What a great lesson though, right? In learning how to talk to people, when you were collecting their money. So, like, it was fascinating. I mean, when you look back on that, the idea that a 11-year-old is allowed to go roam the neighborhood and knock on people's doors and collect money from them. Um, you know, I don't remember. I honestly couldn't tell you today how many people. It felt like a lot that I was delivering papers to, but they did it they did it in zones, and when you had your zone, no one could encroach on your territory.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
the other
Yeah.
thing you learned.
Your little franchise territory. Yeah,
That's
no,
right.
I remember that. That's I hadn't thought about that in a while. That's so great. All right, so you got first, and now tell us about the Chiles Group. For those who don't know, tell us about what that company is and kind of what your role is there.
Sure. So the Chiles Group is best known for the fact that for 45 years, Ed Chiles started three restaurants or progressed three restaurants along their lifespan. The smallest of which was Mar Vista Pub um, on Longboat Key. The largest of which was the Beach House in Bradenton Beach, and the most iconic was the Sandbar in the town of Anna Maria. So he started with the Sandbar in 1979, and about 12 years later had Mar Vista and then the Beach House. And in that progress, of course, built the companies up to be very successful. Smartly owned the land underneath each of the restaurants. So that was helpful in that we weren't always having to deal with increased rents. But those three restaurants were, nearly 1,000 seats and lots of iconic visits by people who would come and visit the island and have memories over those 45 years. Well, we had about 400 employees. We sold those three restaurants in August of 2024. And that was a big change for our company, right? So we scaled down rather dramatically. Now we have a significant amount of rental real estate, commercial and residential, and we have property in Parish. We own an organic farm out there, and we own a nearby 18-acre parcel, which um, we're holding on to and contemplating if we do something with. 6 of those acres are zoned for a restaurant, so who knows? Maybe someday there'll be another restaurant if Ed want as he puts it, if he wants to climb another mountain. So,
Yes, back in the game, and Ed, of course, as you mentioned, grew that restaurant business pretty significantly and successfully. And what I think is really interesting, and Ed actually is a former guest on From the Corner Office podcast. What I think is really fascinating to me too is that you have a connection to the Childs family that even predates Ed. And I want to get into your career earlier before the restaurant and hospitality business. Tell us about that part of it, working for Ed's father, former Florida Governor Lawton Chiles.
Right. Well, I've been very lucky in my career to have C-suite roles in the government, nonprofit, and for-profit sectors. And in each of those sectors, I've learned different skill sets, right? Because they each require significantly different constituents that you manage. My relationship with Lawton Chiles does not predate Ed because my first interaction was with Ed when he ran for the state senate at the same time his father was running for governor. And yeah, so if you look back in the records, you'll see that Ed Chiles was running against John McKay. John McKay won that race and later went on to represent Manatee County. And but that was the same time that Lawton Chiles and Buddy McKay were on the Democratic ticket to become governor. And so it was Chiles versus McKay in Manatee County and Chiles and McKay in the rest of the state of Florida. So Ed ran that race, did not win. I helped Ed in the last 6 or 7 weeks of that campaign um, because he had had some transition in management. And I came over from the east coast of Florida a few days each week to help out. And afterwards, he suggested to his dad that his dad should hire me. And so I ended up having to got an offer from the governor, but had to decline. My father was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, and so I stayed with my dad and helped take care of him until he passed. And after he did, one of the things we talked about, my dad had been very involved in politics, and he had been at one point the general counsel for the Florida Republican Party. And my mother had been the vice president of the Florida League of Women Voters. So they were on both sides of the political spectrum in
Yes. Wow.
my household long before Carville and Matlin
Yeah.
became known
They were
as the
pioneers, the
that's right. And
wolves.
you know, in our household on Sunday nights, we used to have guests, and I would learn how to interview them over Sunday night dinner. And when I was a kid, even though I announced at age 10 that I would never be a lawyer because it required too much patience. So, but then I went to work for Lawton, and early on I was his body man. You know, the guy who's always with the governor while he's traveling and that kind of thing. And then Hurricane Andrew hit, and I arranged. I mean, the logistics of being the body man during a hurricane like that are crazy. There were stories about how the governor was on the phone with the White House as we were flying into the storm from Tallahassee into South Florida, and that was me placing the call and getting the White House on the line and getting the governor to talk to people in the White House and asking for federal assistance before we even touched down. And there was a big snafu, and that was also 1992 when Bill Clinton and George Bush were running against each other. And and so they both had to fly in, you know, and we had to give them tours, and they had to show their empathetic
Yes.
side
Photo
for the
ops. Yeah.
yeah. So
Wow. What did you learn? Governor Childs had such a stellar career in politics and leadership. What did you learn about leading people, leading teams from Governor Childs?
that's a great question, Mark. I'll tell you that in the beginning, I don't know that I understood what I was learning, right? I was like 30 years old and I'm not sure I understood, but I did understand that he knew what he had in me and that he placed me in charge of the recovery effort from Hurricane Andrew. And then he assigned me to a field office to run South Florida, everywhere except Miami. We'll come back to that Miami in a second. But the learnings were that I was able to be placed in the right place at the right time by him. So I mentioned the Hurricane Andrew efforts, and then I was put in charge of the operations of his reelect in 1994, which he won. But the family, including Ed, kept reminding me that he had never lost a race. He had never lost a race. He had never lost a race. And in 1994, the race ended with him as the victor, but the closest margin in the history of Florida up till that point. There were no hanging chads in
Right. It was
1994.
right before then. Right.
That and then I was given the responsibility. So the hurricane, the reelect, and then he settled this lawsuit with the tobacco industry. And then I got to create the Truth Campaign, and that was one of the more significant things. But I think the lessons from Lawton himself were um, to listen more than speak. He was a excellent listener. He was a sly listener too, because people would leave his office thinking he agreed with them, always. And his questions were never uh, too pointed, or were rarely too pointed. Every once in a while, they were very direct, but he would work the edges of the question, and he would listen a lot. And so I think that was probably my best lesson from him.
One of the things that, you talked about the hurricanes, and that's really interesting. Listening as a leader, so important, and comes up a lot on this podcast. But when you're talking about, being there at Hurricane Andrew as a leader, how do you lead with certainty when things are so uncertain? And that could even be in the hospitality industry, right? Where there's, whether it's COVID or, the economy, or just different things happening. So as a leader, how do you foster certainty when things are very far from certain?
Well, each situation is unique, Mark. You can't say that there's only one way to foster certainty. And in fact, in some cases, it's beneficial not to foster certainty. It's better to be in the trenches and just as uncertain as your people, but let them know that you're there, right? So in COVID, we were just as uncertain as everybody else. Um, Now, we pushed through and we had a very generous owner who kept paying people even when we were shut. And that was those were very smart strategic moves for our company. It allowed us to bounce back very quickly. But, this question of certainty, there is sometimes certainty gets confused with direction. And it's important to understand that the leader's job is to make sure people are moving in the right direction, that they have got a focal point and they know why or where they're going, right? So um, even in a case of uncertainty, they should at least know what the thinking is from leadership, and not be left to fill in a vacuum, right? Not have a void of direction. So direction, I think, can be more important than certainty. We're still going to operate, for instance. We are still going to be restaurants. We're not shutting down and selling, that kind of thing. And we're going to find ways to keep people engaged and employed. So those were directions, as opposed to being able to say, certainly we're going to open on X date, right? Or certainly your paycheck's not going to be reduced, or certainly we couldn't be 100% certain about anything in that case. But providing direction, I think, is even more important. You talked about earlier, Mark, you talked about the important traits of being a leader. Listening is an important trait, but I think it's second to curiosity, because curiosity is in my mind anyway, especially from C-suite level positions. Without curiosity and without asking the questions, which requires you to talk a little more than listen sometimes, but um, without asking those questions, you're not going to get to the heart of a matter. Uh, Typically, sometimes you will, because you'll have good people around you who know, after they worked with you for a while, they know how to get right to the heart of the matter. But anyway, curiosity, I would put at the top of that list.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about it a lot in our work, as I coach our reporters, the Observer Media Group. Be curious, not cynical. There's way too many cynical people in general, but there's too many cynical reporters. And be curious. Go talk to somebody and ask questions.
Exactly. And it's in the political world, sometimes it's a gotcha game, right? The questions are gotcha games, and you have to find ways. Um, my style is a little more direct than a lot of people, and my questions can sometimes feel pointed. But after people work with me for a while, they understand they're not leading. they're honest, they're curious, right? I really want to understand in order to have the best data and information to make decisions.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating and definitely good advice. How, or actually, who has influenced your leadership? You know, who in your life, and what examples stand out that has influenced you?
Well, it's a great question, and I've had so many interesting mentors and people in my life. As I approach 65 this year, I am in a situation where I think I've been looking back even more. And had a fantastic career with the Boy Scouts of America, and was surrounded by a lot of adults who provided a lot of guidance, whether they were my scoutmaster or whether they were the chief scoutmaster when I worked for the national office. They were a chief scout executive. They were, there were a lot of people on that board of directors. My first board experience was for the Boy Scouts of America. And, these were a significant number of Fortune 500 CEOs who served on that board and people I got to know. In addition to reading lots of books while I was in college, and certainly coming, in the mid 80s, Jack Welch and his world at General Electric was everybody was parroting and, thinking, okay, this guy's the guru. And then
Yeah,
you learn 20 years later, no, that not so much. Everybody wants to go in a different direction.
totally
And so
different way. Yeah,
when I say that there's one person, or, I'd say Jim Collins' books have been helpful. And I certainly learned a lot from them. There are a number of authors and philosophers along the way. But after you get to this age, they meld, right? And different snippets from different books and different lessons you've learned. Um, so I would say there are probably 100, but including my parents, lessons learned along the way from relatives and that kind of thing. So,
yeah. I mean, your parents sound. We could do another podcast. That sounds really fascinating. The conversations that you had. I mean, anybody stand out in your mind that you got to meet during this young, young boy experience you had?
they all kind of at this age, frankly, they've all melded together. But one of the things that was a kind of a rule around the table was that these are conversations just for the house. And so you didn't walk out quoting anything, and you didn't like that was an early lesson, right? That was a very fascinating. I was really lucky as a kid. Now, my brother and sister were more the athletes in the family, and I was more the student government guy. And so I participated in that stuff a lot more. And then that changed a little bit after my um parents split up and that kind of thing. So
Yeah. One last question on leadership, Chuck, is as you grew in your career, restaurants, whatever other entities, or even campaigning, what do you look for in leaders? You know, when you're looking to put somebody in a position of leadership at the restaurant, at some other entity, what stands out to you that you're looking for?
Mark, I think if you look at an entire career at different levels, whether it's the for-profit sector, the nonprofit sector, or the government, um, hiring people is the single most important thing you do. Right now, it is closely tied to culture, um, but the right people help create the right culture. And I would much rather have cultural fits than star players who are solo practitioners, if you will. And so when you're building the team, it's you can't do it in a vacuum, right? I I remember one time I tried something very unique in a hiring process for a chief financial officer, and I had uh, narrowed the field and I wanted participation from my other senior team, but I didn't want them in the room during the interview. And the reason is I did two groups of 7 interviews, meaning 7 candidates for the job were in the room together.
Wow, really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and what I was looking for in the interview process was how they would interact with each other. right? How they would answer questions and feed off of other people in the room. Because sometimes the CFO can be left to be a solo player. And, they work in finance, and finance is considered kind of back of the house and not a significant role. I don't see it that way because, if if you don't have a healthy financial picture and everybody understands it, then you're not really, it's hard to progress. So so this was a rather unique experience, and I think probably if I tried to run it by HR or told a bunch of lawyers what I was doing, they would tell me I couldn't do it. But luckily, as a CEO, you get to take your own advice and sometimes try it. And this turned out to be one of the best lessons of my career is that I learned so much about how to look for um, uh, quality people in their ability to interact with others, right? So these are their peers in the interview process, right? These are people that, in theory, they're at the same level in organizations that they're other organizations they are in. And so it made it a lot easier to make the hire in the end. Now we were live streaming to the rest of the office, so the other people on my team could watch it real time. This was before texting was big, so they weren't like texting me questions or anything. They just got to
Ask him
watch.
this, ask him this. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but they got to watch and then afterwards participate in my decision making about who they felt they would work with.
Yeah, that's really fascinating too, because you mentioned the one thing that really stands out to me about that is the ability to see how they interact with others, because you can't get that obviously in a one-on-one interview. You're asking them a question, they're giving you an answer, and you're deciding on it. But how you interact with others in any field, right, is so important to kind of see that.
Yeah, and in most interviews they'll say like, "All right, I'm going to have you do a group interview with these three people who are the finance team," and so you'll like, but there's a power dynamic there that doesn't work, right? So, whereas if you put them in the room with other people of the same, in theory, the same caliber, and watch how they interact. Now, the nicest thing about that for me is that the person who ended up getting the role is now executive director of an association in DC, and his career progressed brilliantly after working for me, and so I knew I had made the right choice. I later retired from that organization and left DC, but I it was a great learning experience for me and for him and for, I think, the other people who participated. So
Yeah. Awesome. Chuck, one last question as we are getting underway here 2026. What are you most looking forward to this year? What are you excited about turning 65? But what else are you excited about in terms of the Chiles Group and what's going on in your business?
well, it's fascinating to run a different size organization, right? Same name, but it's no longer the dynamic world of the restaurants that change, as you pointed out, that change daily, right? So that's that's kind of an adjustment. I think I'm learning to work uh, smarter and less. So how I can make sure that the rest of the team pulls up more and more of the responsibility. Um, our big excitement is the farm right now, right? So we've got this wonderful organic farm, Gamble Creek Farms, out in Parrish, Florida, and um, it was bought originally. Oh, this is so we started leasing the farm in 2013, and Ed was all excited to be able to serve this fresh stuff in our restaurants, and it helped a lot. After we sold the restaurants, we didn't have restaurants to service. So some people still wanted our real organic certified vegetables, but now what we're doing is running a market store basically, and more people are finding it who live out there. And of course, we decided to buy the farm and no pun intended. And in January of 2020, I brilliantly negotiated the purchase of the farm. Of course, 6 weeks later, having a farm to serve the restaurants didn't look so bright because, I had also like renegotiated our parking lot leases in 5 years, and I thought I'd do all these great moves, and not so much. I looked foolish. Now, luckily, we bounced back from that, and that was just a blip. But the farm is the most exciting thing now. For instance, we just launched selling natural and organic wine and beer out at the farm. So now we have the proper licensure to sell wine and beer with our vegetables and become more of a neighborhood market for that fastest growing zip code in Florida. So
Yeah, fantastic. Chuck Wolfe with the Chiles Group. Thank you so much for joining us on the From the Corner Office podcast.
been great to be with you, Mark.
Thank you for listening to the Business Observer From the Corner Office podcast. I'm your host, Mark Gordon. This podcast was produced by Reed Corley of the Corley Company in Sarasota. To hear more episodes of From the Corner Office podcast, go to businessobserverfl.com.